Welcome to Parenting Teens with Dr. Cam, the podcast dedicated to helping you tackle the challenges of parenting teenagers without the drama. I'm your host, Dr. Cam. Let's get on with the show. You remember your first crush, right? The butterflies, the awkward conversations, the epic heartbreak that felt like the end of the world. Well, today's teens are navigating all that plus identity shifts, consent culture, and a digital minefield of ghosting and situationships. Today, I'm joined by journalist, professor, and mom, Lisa A. Phillips, author of First Love, Guiding Teens Through Relationships and Heartbreak. We're going to unpack how teen dating has changed, why your kid might not be telling you everything, and how to actually help without scaring them off. If you've ever felt clueless about your teen's love life or terrified of saying the wrong thing, this episode's for you. But before we talk heartbreak, connection, and how to show up when it matters most, I need to ask you a quick favor. If this podcast ever makes you feel less alone, more understood, or a little more hopeful, please go hit follow so you don't miss an episode. And if what you hear today hits home, leave a quick review. It helps me support you better and helps more parents find this podcast when they need it most. All right, let's start talking teen relationships. Lisa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so let's start off. How did you get interested in relationships, particularly during adolescence?
Well, for quite a few years now, I have been a reporter who covers relationships and mental health. I like to say I'm on the love and heartbreak beat. And I got really interested in this subject. This probably will not be a surprise when my daughter began to date a neighbor boy when she turned 13. And I kind of freaked out. Everything was going fine with the relationship. He was a very nice boy. They had a sweet rapport. They seemed to really be enjoying themselves. However, the depth of my fears and my nervousness around this issue was really intense. It kind of reminded me when my daughter was a newborn and I was worried about every little thing. And I realized that what was happening is all these concerns were coming from the fact that I was worried about her reliving some of the pain that I had gone through in my teen years and even my young adult years, and really until I met the man that I would marry, my husband, her father. So because I'm a journalist and because I dwell in this terrain of mental health and relationships, I started doing the things that curious people do, which is to figure out what's out there about this subject. And what I found was, though there's quite a bit of information about sex and sexuality, and really great information, I should say, love and the emotions surrounding love, there wasn't a whole lot around that. Yeah. And so I decided to change that and write a book that really focused on the emotions of first relationships, dating, crushes, relationships, and pretty much all the gray areas in between.
I love this. And you're right, there's so much fear around this too. What do you think are the leading reasons parents get so freaked out when their kids start dating?
I think they get freaked out because they're really thinking hard about their emotional legacy. What have I modeled as a person in a relationship or having relationships in front of my child? In some cases, parents get really self-conscious if they aren't in a relationship or having relationships, and they're thinking, "Oh, am I modeling isolation or keep this world away?" So there's a self-consciousness that comes into play, and we are very worried that the ways that we are flawed, and we're all flawed as people and as parents, will somehow be passed along to our child. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we're also very concerned about the grief and pain of romantic disappointment, which is one of the most intense things human beings can feel. And who would not want to protect their child from that, even though we really cannot? So I think that's the primary reason why parents get so concerned about these things. It also stirs up feelings about parents' own past regrets, things they wanted out of their first experiences and didn't have, things they want out of their current relationship and are not getting. It stirs a lot of that up. And this is not just something that parents share anecdotally, which they readily do, as I've found. It's also something in the research.
Right. And so we're taking all of this and now putting it on our teen, and we're trying to protect them from all of this. Is that the right thing to do?
Well, I think the first step is realizing that we can't.
Mm-hmm.
And realizing that sometimes the urge to protect this impossible thing gets translated into the attempt to minimize, the attempt to shrink pain instead of validating it. So I think that is a really important first step, because so often the first conversation a young person has with a parent about the emotions surrounding attraction and love is a conversation about disappointment. I had this crush, the person doesn't like me back, it's horrible, what do I do? And so often our first impulse is to be like, oh, it's just a crush. You're going to move on. You're going to get over it. And though in many ways that's true, what that does is it sends a very strong message to young people that this isn't really real pain. And in the moment, they're feeling real pain. So validating that pain is an incredibly important first step, according to the many experts that I talk to. And I think just also the testimonies of parents who have found these different ways of coping. Those were also object lessons that could be shared with my readers. The many stories of parents dealing with the disappointment of a crush or a first breakup.
Yeah. So they're going to go through the pain.
Yes.
That's not something we even want to prevent them from. It's helping them learn how to work through it without minimizing it.
Exactly, which really is an art. And there are quite a few tips in the book about how to navigate the difference between kind of joining in with your young person and extending the pain, what's called co-ruminating, when you dwell and what did that awful person do today? And what about tomorrow? And what about last week? And then more, I think, sort of deeper, more important ways of saying pain is pain. We have to go through it. It's going to be something that some days you wake up and you just need to know this isn't going to go away anytime soon. And that's very human. And then helping a young person develop some concrete strategies for moving forward from that point when it's time.
So let's walk through the entire kind of lifetime of the relationship so parents know how to navigate that. And then we'll get into the what do we do when they're crushed, which ultimately most are, because they're not typically marrying their first love, right?
Yes.
Not all, some do. But okay, so I have a teenager who wants to start dating. I think they're too young. Let's say a parent thinks they're too young, but let's be real. Parents think any age is too young, but I think they're too young. My child wants to date. How do I navigate that without being like, you cannot date, which means they'll probably go behind my back?
Yeah, you said the most important thing, that a hard no, you're too young for these feelings, you're too young a hard no indicating too young for the feelings, I'm not going to let you do it, will indeed chase what's happening underground, which huge theme in my book, time and time again. When young people are underground with their relationships, it means parents and other trusted adults won't know what's going on, which means they won't be able to offer support when it's needed, which is a very risky situation for the young person. So that first part is really important. However, it's also very important not to be so rigid about the do's and don'ts, that you're not taking into account the fact that different parents and families have different values around dating. So I think the first step is for a parent to do the hard work of articulating their values around dating and relationships, including that very difficult thing to express, which is, here are the reasons why I'm concerned about your age and the feelings surrounding dating and certainly sexuality and sex, right? Because all those things are going to be swimming around together. So that is going to be different for different parents. My own way of approaching this could be very different than a listener's. But the common theme is transparency, explaining where you stand, because young people really get a lot from that. It's a show of respect to them and where they're at. And it's also a way for them to understand the kinds of policies you want to set. And so from there, the relationship policies come. Whether or not the young person engages in dating, once you've expressed these things, you still can set rules for what goes on in your home. If you want the person to come over, if the person is allowed to come over, here are the things that need to happen. The doors need to be open, or you need to be in common areas. All these things, which if a parent is concerned about things happening too soon, can kind of put a container and brakes around it. Again, if that's their value system. And that also will mean things like, I'm really going to want to get the phone number of the other person's parents and be in touch with that person, because different homes will have different rules. And again, that may not be something you can control, but the communication with the other parent will be really key around this, to sort of figuring out where each person stands and what to do. And I think, again, it's a sign of respect for what's going on. So I think that those are some starting points for responding if a parent feels a child is too young to date. And they're just starting points. You've got to be able to really tune into your child to think about what kind of maturity or lack of maturity are they bringing into this situation, and to kind of gauge what happens from there on in.
Yeah, I think it's important too to ask your teen what exactly they mean by dating, because a lot of younger kids, I shouldn't say little, but younger kids will be like, I'm dating. And that means they walk each other to class and they text each other, so we also want to not assume dating means what we think of dating, right? And kind of build on that. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, this is very much an ages and stages thing. And I can't set really hard lines in terms of ages, because it can vary so much depending on your community. But so often this really is almost like a parallel play situation where not much really happens. And when your 10-year-old or your 11-year-old says, I want to date this person, but yes, ask and figure out what that means to a child who is just about to enter adolescence or is in early adolescence. Absolutely.
Now, one of the things I hear a lot from clients is when their kids start dating somebody or are interested in somebody, they become fully immersed and don't want to do anything else. They're hanging out with them all the time, and the parents feel like they're losing their kids to this other person. And now we're trying to reclaim, and it almost becomes a battle between mom and dad and the person that their child is interested in. How do we handle that situation?
Yeah, this is something in my book I call over-enmeshment. In various conversations, I've called losing yourself to love or to a relationship. And it's so tricky because it's very nuanced. I mainly spoke with young people who were just out of their high school years, basically between 18 and 25, because I wanted to speak to them with some critical reflection on the experiences they had when they were in high school and earlier. And I did hear stories that definitely had elements of over-enmeshment, but sometimes the things that the parents see are very different than the things the child experiences. And that there can be a certain kind of growth that's happening within a relationship that parents don't always give credibility to, because we're so concerned about the grades and the life goals and being a certain kind of person and individuating. So I think that a really important way to deal with this is to do your very best, and teens, as we know, can be very challenging on this front, to have communication around the relationship. And some useful terms that I learned from the experts I interviewed are terms that tap into this psychological model called the self-expansion model of close relationships. And that holds that, in a good, close relationship, you expand yourself. And so some of the language you can use is to say, like, when you're with this person, do you feel like more of yourself or less of yourself? And to really engage with the young person about this. Sometimes the answer is not going to feel incredibly credible. If a person's terribly in love, they'll be like, oh, I feel like so much more of myself. But then I think you can kind of be like, well, I noticed you used to like be always on time for track meets and really, really into how you were doing and your teammates. And that's diminished a little bit. So can you tell me a little bit about that? And those kinds of conversations, I think, can help a young person to be like, hey, mom or dad is actually watching and noticing this. And to get them to think about the person they were before this relationship and the person they are now and why those changes are occurring. What kind of awakening is going on, or is this actually a diminishing? So this is hard work. Again, no easy answers, but I think we want to be able to break down this idea of, oh my goodness, my child is so consumed, and really look at what is going on in there and engage in critical reflection with this young person.
That is so much different than you're getting distracted. You need to stop doing this. You need to focus on this instead, which makes them go underground or makes them resent us and doesn't necessarily help them self-reflect, like you were saying, which is what we want them to be able to learn during this time. This is a great time for them to learn who they are in a relationship and how relationships impact them and how they should make them feel. And I want to kind of take that from there, because I see a lot of kids who define their value based on the attention of the opposite sex or the same sex if they identify as gay. But what am I how do I handle it as a parent when I see my teen really kind of going after this attention and desperate for this attention, and sometimes making really poor choices in order to get that intention? How do I help that person, help my teen?
That is such a good question. I think that this is, again, going to take really careful engagement. And one thing that I've found, I teach a college course called Love and Heartbreak. And one of the most important moments in this class is when I bring up the idea of narcissism, right? Young people, like, because of social media, they love to talk about narcissism, and the guy who dumped them or the girl who dumped them is narcissistic, blah, blah, blah.
Every ex is narcissistic.
Yes, exactly. But then there's also this other part of narcissism, which I've learned in my years reporting on this issue, which is when people use somebody else to fill themselves up, even if it's like a needy and seemingly humble way of doing it, like, I need you so much, as opposed to I'm going to use you for so much. That's still narcissism. And so when you offer up this expanded definition of narcissism to young people, sometimes the response is really powerful. And they're like, oh yeah, this is a way of using someone too, when I'm so weak inside myself that I'm really, really leaning on this person for my value, and I need them for my value. So I think that can be a very important first step in dealing with this. But that's a really, really tough one, because it can often connect to tendency toward depression or anxiety, where the person becomes this soother. Another way to engage around it is to engage around the incredible pressure and responsibility that other person, even if they might enjoy it for a while, could start to feel with that. And talking about that is, hey, this person needs their health and their independence too. So think about what this does if you're leaning that hard on the other person. Yeah. So again, open communication and reflection, using some of these ideas as anchors and ways to get the conversation started.
Do you see a part of this as a lack of confidence in themselves, or not being able to see any additional value? And how can parents help their teens when they notice this and go, okay, they are now measuring their worth on the attention they get from others? How, as a parent, do I help them find other ways to find their self-worth outside of that?
I think this is kind of an eternal quest for parents of young people, whether they're in a relationship or not, is to help them find sources where places where they feel that they are needed and play a role. It's not all about, self-esteem is a really important concept, but a lot of it is about like, who am I in the world? How am I part of community? How can I be a person who shows kindness and caring to other people and welcomes it and receives it in turn? I'm very, very influenced by the work of Richard Weisbord, who's been talking about this stuff for years. And so I think that it's not just about like, hey, make sure you spend tons of money on ballet lessons or skateboarding lessons or something like that. So my kid feels really good about a skill or a thing. It's really about who they are in the world and how connected and needed they are, and how like where their social ties are too. Yeah. And really shoring those things up as important parts of who they are, that this isn't all about this one person. And reminding them too of the kind of difficult reality that relationships in the teen years are very likely to end. So if you're resting so much on this one person, it's going to really be hard if and when that happens.
Yeah. Now, here's one that I hear a lot. You do not like, as a parent, the person that your teen has decided to date, and your teen is so enamored by this person and you think they are bad news. How do we handle that?
This is a tough one, and I've gone through it, though in a fairly light form compared to some of the other forms that I've heard, but I have been there. I think that there are a few things to keep in mind. One is that if you go down the road, which is seems the most obvious road, and say, what are you doing with this person? And make it clear that you don't like this person. The way the teen will receive this information is very likely as a judgment on who they are, because who they choose to be with is a reflection of who they are according to them. And that's also a real thing too. We would apply it to a friend or anybody else. So you want to be very careful with that kind of language and focus on the data and the information that your young person will hopefully share with you. Yeah. So an example I give is with this boy that my daughter was with, and I wasn't that comfortable with him. He started to disappoint her. He wouldn't show up at her music performances. He became less communicative, all kinds of things. And she would tell me this and try to puzzle it out, as all of us do, including young people.
Right.
And I looked at her and I said, that's information.
Yeah.
And that line is meant to emphasize the fact that in relationships, one of the things you do is show up for people in the special moments of their lives. And if the partner is not showing up at the special moments in their lives, or in other ways doing things that are disappointing and hurtful, you can underscore those things without judgment. And that requires incredible patience. When you just want to scream, get away from this person.
Yeah.
Another tool, which is really important, especially for those really difficult times when these situations could potentially turn into abusive relationships, which is a reality in teen relationships, is to use the technique that dating abuse activists have shared with me, which is to have conversations with your child about the differences between feeling and fact, right? So there's the feeling of, I love this person, I'm dedicated to this relationship. And then there are the facts of, this person wants all my passwords. This person won't leave me alone or let me have any friends independent of him, her, them. And those feelings and facts help you start to have a language around safety and around helping your young person realize that they are holding two really different things in their heart, fear and love.
Yeah.
And again, having just excruciating patience and offerings of support and concrete strategies to help them navigate those things.
I think this is so important because everything you're talking about is complete opposite of you can't see this person. Because when we put ourselves against that person, chances are very good we're going to lose, which then we lose our influence. We lose information that they're coming to us, which means we can't help them navigate a difficult situation. When in fact, them navigating a difficult situation now with you there able to support them is going to be amazing information and experience and knowledge to take into the real world so they don't get themselves stuck in those situations and get stuck in a pattern.
Yeah.
So,
I'm sorry, could I add a little bit
yeah,
to that?
please.
Because I love that you emphasize that. The thing that struck me in reporting this book, and I talked to more than 100 young people and parents, getting their stories, hearing about their first experiences. The thing that struck me was how quickly young people shut down. And you think you're just saying something really casual. One
Yeah.
big example is a daughter coming to the parents and saying, "Oh, I have a girlfriend." And the parents commenting something like, "Oh, I thought, how come you don't like boys? I thought you liked boys." And the young person that I'm thinking of, and along with several other sources for this book, just clammed up, did not mention a word about the relationship, did not mention a word about the next relationship, which in fact was with a boy, actually a man much older, and the relationship turned abusive. And because she felt that very early judgment of her relationship choices, she did that thing that teens do and put up that wall. I
Yeah.
don't want to be
Protection.
judged. And it's terribly unfair to parents, right? Because we do know best, right? We do.
We want to
We're
help.
older, we're
Yeah.
wiser, we can see things our kids don't see. But we have to be so delicate about this issue of judgment, because the way young people will close off will be firm and long lasting.
Yeah. I think when you say parents know best, I always want to put a caveat there because often parents believe we know our kids better than they know themselves. I have never ever found that to be true.
Yeah,
Our
no,
kids know,
that's
right?
important.
So you're
Yep,
right.
yep.
We see things, we know signs, we can see how a relationship's impacting. We definitely know that more, and we want to be able to share that. But sometimes if we get in and think we know how the child feels more than they know, we're then going to shut them down too because they're like, you don't even understand me as an individual person, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah, it was more speaking to that, like, when you see bad news walk in the door, that
I
kind of stuff. But it's
I
true,
know
we
you did. I
won't
wanted to
know the
clarify
feelings.
that because I
Yes,
do hear
absolutely.
parents say that. Okay, so our kids now dating somebody and they're spending a lot of time with them, and we're doing our best to not judge the person, ask questions that are from curiosity and just hoping our kids think critically, hopefully getting to know that person, inviting them into our home so we get to know who this other person is and learn and understand why our child, who we love so much, loves this person, right? Which can teach us a lot about our child. Now it gets ugly and they start to fight, or we see that they're not being treated well and our kids are coming home crying and upset. How do we handle that?
Crying and upset because it's over or because they're fighting?
Let's start with fighting and then we'll
Okay.
do over. So now they're fighting and they're in this entanglement. How do we handle that situation?
So fights happen. They are upsetting. That's a reality that all of us face with friends, lovers, spouses, relationships, the whole nine yards. So I think, again, first step, validating, listening to the pain, validating the pain. A very handy tool I came across in reporting this book was a relationship workshop developed at SUNY Stony Brook. Really lovely, elegant, and research-based workshop. And it breaks down a number of things, and I'll shortcut to this point that I think is so important, which is um, the workshop identifies one of the essential components of a relationship is mutuality. The understanding that both people in a partnership have needs, and it needs to be acknowledged that both sets of needs are important.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of these core principles that can be a wonderful starting point for working with a young person around relationship problems and relationship strife. And it asks the young person to break down, like, okay, what needs do I have that aren't getting met? What needs does the other person have that aren't getting met? And how willing are we to deal with each other's needs?
Yeah.
And so if you can guide the reflective part of that conversation, once you've validated the pain and move on to reflection, toward that idea of mutuality and needs, you will be helping the teen gain a really incredible skill in relationships that can last through their whole life. I do this workshop, I'm trained to do it. And whenever I do it, I think, oh my goodness, if I had only known this, when I started dating. And young people really respond so well to this. It's so simple, and it helps them break this stuff down. So they can start to figure out, what are my, bottom line needs, things that are not negotiable, and what are some ways that I can bend and become softer around this person and their stated needs. How can I cross that bridge to meet their needs? Are these things that I'm willing to do? And that helps them break down some of that pain of the argument.
What an amazing opportunity to teach our kids while they're learning about relationships, how to do them in a healthy way, so that when they go off into marriage and real relationships down the road, oh my gosh, can you imagine if more people knew actually how to do relationships in a healthy way? Because a lot of us go in there not knowing that, right? And we're learning together in a messy, messy way instead of having those skills. And what I didn't hear is parents siding with the person or siding with their child going, yeah, that person's a jerk. You should get rid of them. We don't want to throw the other person under the bus because that A is not helping the child get better or figure out themselves. And two, what if they get back together with them? And now you totally have said things that you can't take back and aren't going to go well moving forward.
Yeah. And there can be the narrative of mom and dad are against me.
Correct.
Which it can be really tough. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are moments, though, when a child comes to you in pain that are real light bulb moments where you can be like, wait, do you realize what you just said?
Yeah.
That you walk into school and he ignores you. I want you to take that data in.
Yeah.
So that you can do when it's coming from them, to be like, hey, you got to this place. What does this mean to you?
Yeah.
Do you want to be this person in this relationship?
Yeah, but it's putting the onus on the teen to think that through rather than telling them the answer, which they're going to immediately shut down and not listen to. But when they come through that, we're teaching them how to think critically. Okay, now they've broken up and they are in their rooms for days. They don't want to go to school. They're crying. You are like so terrified that they're even going to possibly hurt. They're just devastated. How do we handle that situation?
That's such a tough one. The stories that I heard in the interviews that I did really, they still break my heart when I talk about them. Parents rushing home from a dinner out, driving into the driveway and hearing their son from behind the upstairs closed window screaming, I miss her already.
Aww.
Just these heartbreaking stories. For so many young people, this is really their first real experience of loss. And again, going back to where we started, the validation part is so important, where you're not going to just charge in there and be like, okay, dude, it's time to go play soccer, get back into your life. You really have to spend time. And with boys, this is particularly important because often they've lost the only place where it's permissible for them to be emotional beings when they lose a relationship. And that's so huge. This doesn't take away from the pain of girls, of course, but this is something to keep in mind with our boys. And then I think that an important approach is to kind of do that dance of validating the pain and then also taking the time to help the teen work through some concrete strategies. Because when they can solve the smaller problems, that gives them a little bit of a sense of their power and their efficacy in the world, which they so need at this point, in this moment of vulnerability. So, advocating to your boss, for example, hey, I really need my shifts not to overlap with my ex's for the near future because this is just going to be too painful. Things like that, those kinds of strategies. How do I get my stuff back from the other person's house? Those are really huge. And then as the young person moves through this acutely painful period, making sure they stay in touch with their life. A day in bed, a couple days in bed is one thing. Missing classes for a week is entirely another. And it's kind of a joke with my students. Like, they know they're going to get a little break, maybe one extension if a breakup happens, but no more than that, because they've got to re-enter their lives. That's incredibly important.
Yeah.
Not just as this buck up thing, but as a, like, their brain needs something else to do, something else to focus on. And then finally, I think parents should keep in mind that people get over relationships best when they can build a narrative of redemption. And what I mean by that is, I had this experience, I fell in love, I got my heart broken, and I learned something about myself and what I want. That those stories, and I don't mean fairy tales, I mean very real stories where you figure out what you learned and what you want in the future and you move forward, are incredibly powerful. They actually, research has shown, they shorten the time of recovery from a relationship. What doesn't is, this person's a jerk, like a really flat story of this person's a terrible person, or even a story like a lightning strike, like, I don't know what happened. This came out of the blue. I don't know what happened. That does happen sometimes, but usually with some reflection, you'll get a little bit of, actually, there were some signs, and maybe I need to be thinking about this moving forward into the future. So trying to foster those critical thinking skills to help the young person reflect on their future and how they'll grow from this, incredibly important.
I love that. That is so important. And I think all of this is taking all of this moment, instead of approaching it with fear, approaching it as, this is a life experience that they're going to continue having. How do I help be that supportive guide as they learn it, not to protect them from it, but to learn from whatever comes their way through it, because that is a life experience they're going to learn from, right?
Yeah. And if I could add to one thing I haven't said enough in this conversation, is when all these testing things happen, these difficult things, watching your child be in pain, parents need to take time to take care of themselves, because this will stir up difficult memories. This will stir up, am I somehow at fault? Was this my emotional legacy? Especially if there are things that happen that feel very close to things you yourself experienced. So that is a very important element of all this. It's not of course, it's not up to the child to take care of you this way, and you don't want to shift the conversation toward your needs. But with trusted adults in your life, a spouse, a good friend, a relative, you certainly can get that care and that space to be you.
Yeah. That is so important too, because when you're taking care of yourself and you're checking what is your fear and checking what's your triggers, we don't have to put those on our kids, which they don't need added pressure and anxiety from us on there. It also helps us respond in a more calm way, because I see parents where their kids make a mistake or make a really dangerous or poor choice, and they freak out. The parents freak out, and it adds shame to the kid. It adds all kinds of just, they go down, they go underground again, and they hide things and they feel bad about it, rather than going, okay, this happened. Not great. How do we get through it? You're going to live through this, because kids need to know whatever happens, they're going to make it through. That's resilience, not having a difficult time, but knowing you can make it through difficult times. they need to know we're going to be able to make it through too.
Yeah.
And that they're not responsible for how their life isn't responsible for our life or how we feel.
Yeah. And that is a really startling thing about the parent-child dynamic when a child is in adolescence, is that the child will try to take care of the parent if the parent shifts the conversation, whether it's taking care of them by withdrawing their own expression of their needs or actively trying to do something. It's kind of fascinating because parents don't think that kids want to do this, but they will.
Oh, they do all the time. That is probably the number one reason teens tell me they don't tell their parents things, is because they don't want to add more worry to them. I hear that all the time. And parents don't realize that when we freak out, that says, I can't handle your information. I can't deal with it. So they're like, well, then I'm not going to tell it to you. Anything else that I didn't ask that parents need to know?
Oh, you've asked such good questions. I think that one of the things that I did in this book was I took a look at my own first love and the importance of first loves later in life. And that was a really fascinating dimension of the research where they really do matter. They sort of help us build what one researcher described to me as they don't help us build, but they help us furnish the house. So the parental relationship and the family dynamics are kind of the house, the structure, the things we gravitate toward in relationships, the things that are familiar to us, the models of communication or lack thereof, or what have you, the transference, to use a Freudian term. But then a lot of the furniture and the hangings on the walls and so forth come from our first experiences of intense emotion and pleasure. Those things really do help shape us and form us. And these stories are stories that we can tap into throughout our lives, whether our first loves were good or bad or somewhere in between. I found this real open door in terms of understanding why I kept returning to the story of my first love and making meaning from it in different ways, related ways, but different ways, as a young adult, and then as a newly married person, then as a parent, and then finally as the parent of a teenager who was the age I was when I went through my first love. And so even though my first experience was in many ways a difficult one, it was also in many ways a very expansive one and one that really changed me and shaped me. So I really came to this point of embracing the complexities of that experience and holding it close in new ways. In fact, I reconnected in a friendship way with my first love. And that's been really gratifying because we got to talk about some things we never got to talk about. And that's been great. So if this book brings up questions in your own life about your first love, I would recommend to parents to embrace that and think about that and walk into it and see what's revealed.
I love that. And being able to tap into your own experiences rather from a place of fear, I want to prevent, use it as a way to empathize and relate and go, okay, I went through this. My child's going to go through this. How can I support them through this? And the one other thing I want to add, because you're saying first love, and I think our first loving relationship is between us and our parents.
Yes.
And so how we treat and talk to our kids is how they learn how they should be treated. And so when we treat them with love and respect and passion and compassion and give them an opportunity to say no and set boundaries, we teach them to do that. So when they go into other relationships, they know what that looks like. And I think that's really, really essential.
It is. To add to that, I do want to emphasize that parents should not feel like they need to be perfect beings to model good communication. In fact, so much of this is about transparency, about saying, okay, when your dad and I were together, we may have been demonstrating some things, and here are some things that I'd like you to think about. And no, you don't have to do things this way because I now know I don't have to do things this way. So the openness, the softness around it, the reflection that you bring,
Yeah.
conveying the knowledge that when relationships don't last or when you make mistakes in relationships, that a way you move past them and learn from them can be just as important as what was revealed when the mistakes were happening or the bad dynamics or the difficult dynamics were happening. All these things are very, very important. So I would just encourage anyone out there who's listening to wander into the world of this book, because you will feel like, and I know this is going to sound like a little bit of a sales pitch, that's not really what I
Hey, you
mean.
can do that.
You will feel like you have company, because I don't come at this as a psychologist or even as a researcher in psychology. I come to this as a parent and a journalist, which means I take in a lot from all the stories I hear in addition to the research. And so you will meet on the page many parents and many other teens going through a vast variety of experiences, doing their very best and learning from what happened.
Yeah, I love that. So tell us again the name of the book, where they can find the book, and where they can find you.
Great. The name of the book is First Love: Guiding Teens Through Relationships and Heartbreak. And it's published by Rowman and Littlefield, which is about to become Bloomsbury. And you can find me at lisaamyphillips.com. That's where all my social media handles and such and contact information are.
Wonderful. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
It was so fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And that's a wrap. Thank you, parents, for taking time out of your busy day to listen in. I appreciate you. If you found the episode enlightening, please like, review, and share with a friend navigating the teen years. Until next time, stay curious. Remember, there's always more to the story than what you see.